is Best and the EduCare Foundation, and it's been supported by the SD Bechtel Jr. Foundation. And for those of you who are not familiar with Temescal Associates and How Kids Learn, they're dedicated to improving youth development and education, both in school time and after school expanded learning, with conferences, speaker forums like today, films, training, and coaching sessions. And we're very appreciative of Sam Pia, the founder of How Kids Learn Foundation, Temescal, and he and Stacy Dario, who just direct this amazing work and have really become pioneers in the field of youth development. As I said, for those who've just joining us, welcome. And if you haven't yet, please place your name, organization, or your location inside the chat room so we can get to know who's here today. As Armando said, this is being recorded, and you'll be able to get a link to the recording in a few days from How Kids Learn. So on to the topic of the day, and I know this is probably sitting close to many of us in the field of after school and daytime instruction as well, is what our kids are dealing with in terms of trauma. And it's not just now, it's been, as we know, throughout their childhood, but now it's almost being brought to the front with higher levels of, and many of us know the stats for depression and anxiety in our youth today are just starting to on the rise. So today, we're going to get a chance to explore what is this trauma and what are the practices and strategies that we can use in our after-school programs, and how might we even consider that kids may learn to heal and to gain resiliency. And there's tremendous life lessons that maybe are embedded in the hardest of times, and maybe we can go to that level of learning through this trauma impacted time. So we'll have a wonderful presentation coming in, and I want to introduce Eric Gerner, who I've been delighted to know over the last several years as a leader in the field in Los Angeles and nationally in expanded learning programs and youth development. With a sense of humor, with a deep compassion for kids, his work with LA's Best has been tremendous. For those of you who don't know of LA's Best, just a few words. They serve over 200 elementary schools here and after-school programs throughout LAUSD. And Eric is known as a thought leader in the field. He'll be joined today by Ginger Alvarez and Therese Palacio, two outstanding psychiatric social workers from LAUSD's mental health department. So we'll get that really close to the ground experience that the kids are dealing with as part of today. There'll be times for questions and answers. So throughout, please in the chat room, if you have questions come up, just put them in there, and we'll take pauses throughout for questions and answers, as well as occasional breakout rooms. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Eric, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Stu and Armando. The admiration is mutual. EduCare Foundation is also doing amazing work in the field, and I know you'll hear about some upcoming opportunities with them later. But it's an honor to be here alongside you. And I want to first of all start by thanking Sam Pia and Temescal Associates and How Kids Learn. I've also long been an admirer of Sam from my early days at LA's Best in the late 90s, following his work out of San Francisco that really had such a huge impact on our field across the state. And you know, it's not just his work, but it's the way he facilitated the field coming together to do the work that I especially appreciate. And this is an ongoing example of that. Even though a fair amount of this webinar is us presenting to you, I don't want to give the impression that we at LA's Best think that we are experts in this by any stretch. We have engaged on this journey, as many of you have, to continue to improve and continue to embrace current research and current understandings. And as part of that journey, we love to collaborate and share with others in the field so that we all can grow together. So, you know, I don't have expertise in the area of trauma-informed practice. What I have is the honor to work alongside an amazing team at LA's Best, many of whom I'm happy to see here today, who have chosen to commit themselves to this work. And so we're doing this together, figuring it out as we go. As Debbie Loxton, our Chief Operating Officer, who's joined us today, always says, we're never cooked, we're never done. And so what this is an opportunity to open up the conversation, share with you what we've learned, and to learn from each other. To also start with, just want to say that this this journey that we've gone on at LA's Best of becoming trauma resilient informed could not be possible without um, bigger leadership encouraging us to innovate. So that's on the private side. We have foundations like the Keck Foundation, like Kaiser Permanente, who have long supported our social emotional learning work and cheered us on, encouraged us, and gave us resources to not really pivot, but to continue to deepen our efforts into social emotional learning by joining with this trauma resilient informed work. It's also on the school district side. LA's Best is a partnership of the school district, the mayor's office, and the private sector. And the leadership of Al Cortez at Beyond the Bell, the leadership of Pia Escudero and Joel Cisneros with LAUSD Health and Human Services and LAUSD School Mental Health has been tremendous, has been incredibly supportive, and has been an inspiration. And you'll hear more about that later and the importance of that kind of partnership. So I'm really happy to be here, sort of following in all of their footsteps. So I want to just start off by just beginning to tell the story of our journey here. And then we'll dive into the actual content of what this even means. What does trauma informed mean? What does trauma resilient mean? But just to let you know sort of where we're at in this journey. A few years ago, we were focusing very much on social emotional learning, as we continue to. And we began to hear about new research, new innovation, and new evidence that looked at trauma-informed practice in education, in social work, in medical care, really in all areas of caring for humans of all ages. And it seemed like exciting work, and we wanted to get involved, but we were hesitant for a couple of reasons. And one of the reasons I was hesitant was over the years of studying the issue of equity in education, the issue of equity with children in general, one of the things that I've observed very sadly is that children from more economically distressed backgrounds are overprescribed medication. They're overdiagnosed with issues and syndromes and problems. And they're often seen from a deficit angle rather than an asset-based angle. The goal, in my view, of much of that work is to get children to comply with the expectations of the schooling system. And so that often means to get them to behave properly, to stand in line properly, to take tests properly, to be quiet, to sit down. And at LA's Best, we're not about that. We're not about trying to get kids to be quiet and comply and simply behave properly. We're trying to create the conditions for children to find their passions. We're trying to create conditions for children to find who they truly are, even if it's not what the powers that be want them to be. And so I was worried about getting involved with too clinical of a movement that involves psychiatrists and that sort of thing. And then I started to look into it, and I met Pia Escudero, who at the time was director of school mental health at LAUSD, and I met Joel Cisneros, who is the current director, and began to follow the work of Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who is now the California Surgeon General. And I found that there was actually, at least in California, really expansive leadership who wasn't taking an overly clinical view and who valued investing in prevention of problems, investing in children at the beginning of their lives so that they can find strength and they can thrive, rather than simply addressing symptoms of problems that are not really the children's problems. There are problems of society, community, and problems of oppression and systemic racism and all kinds of other effects of poverty and inequity. And so when I discovered that there was this expansive holistic leadership, as I mentioned, our Chief Operating Officer, Debbie, and I then began to walk a little more confidently in that direction and exploring this. And we got the opportunity to get trained by Pia herself, our leadership staff, got the opportunity to go through, I think it was about 20 hours of training, and really begin to embrace how the coincidence between LA's Best values and this trauma-informed movement values. And when I say LA's Best values, I don't think they're especially exclusive to us. I think all of you on this call who work in youth development really share similar values. We might all say it a slightly different way, put it in different packaging, but I feel that most of our organizations and programs are very aligned. So at that same time, we were working closely with Mary Jo Ginty, may she rest in peace. Many of you knew Mary Jo, who was running technical assistance for expanded learning for LACO, Los Angeles County Office of Education. Was a visionary in the field and unfortunately passed away just last year. And Mary Jo wanted to support this work, and she wanted to see how the work that we were starting to pioneer could be leveraged and shared with programs across Los Angeles and across the state. And so Mary Jo and LACO invested in LA's Best doing a report around what's happening across the country in expanded learning programs, embracing trauma-informed practice. Fortunately, we were connected with Jimena Quiroga Hopkins, who is a fabulous consultant many of you may know. She now works out of her own organization called Thrive Paradigm out of Oakland. And Jimena wrote this report with us and for LACO. And much of the work that I'm about to present in a few minutes is from that report, which is not an official study, it's a snapshot. We took a look at in New York and in Minneapolis and various places and said, what are after school programs doing that connects with this trauma-informed movement? And what we found was interesting and helped us progress, and we want to share that with you. So that's the sort of short version of how we got to this place now. I'm gonna tell the rest of it hopefully quickly as we go along. I'm gonna share my screen in a minute so you can see the agenda, and I want to just dive right into talking about what do we mean by trauma. Before I do though, I want to encourage everybody to use the chat room to share questions that you have along the way. I've encouraged Stu to interrupt me when there are questions that seem relevant and worth addressing as we go. I get very tired of hearing the sound of my own voice this long, and so I don't mind being interrupted with questions. And we can sort of break up the presentation with questions. And then we're going to have an opportunity to share with each other along the way as well. And we just are doing it using the chat room and Stu interrupting me because, as we all know, when everybody goes unmuted and starts interrupting on Zoom, it gets a little chaotic. That's a whole other story that I'd love to delve into, because a pet peeve of mine recently is how often I'm hearing in my own home with my own children doing online schooling, children being told to mute themselves, which I think is a just like poisonous aspect of the situation that we're in right now. And speaking of which, I want to be sure that everybody knows that we are not pretending like we're in normal times in this webinar. We are definitely going to address what all this means in a time of pandemic and quarantine and online schooling. And that's why I'm very happy to have Ginger and Therese, our LA's Best mental health consultants, who are psychiatric social workers out of LAUSD School Mental Health, going to join me for a conversation in just a little while after we've done a little bit of this presentation. And we're going to talk about what this really looks like in our current circumstances. So go ahead and share my screen. But you don't need to see that. Okay, there we go. Stu or Armando, can you just unmute and tell me if you can see the screen okay? It's the title slide.
All good.
Great, thank you. So just to give you a sense of what we're going to be doing for the rest of the short time we have together, we've already jumped into the agenda talking about why we embarked on this journey. We want to look at really understanding what trauma and adverse childhood experience means, what we're seeing in our programs in LA, looking at what trauma resilient expanded learning means, and to have a conversation, like I said, about trauma and the pandemic. So I talked a little bit about this already, but the question comes up, why transform now, right? Because we really do look at this as transformative work. Some things have come and gone as trends in the field, things that we embrace and then sort of let go of, and things that we embrace because funders are pushing them or because current research is coming along and then sort of dissipates. And we've participated in many of those things at LA's Best. But we don't look at this as that kind of passing trend. We really do see this as transformational work that will continue for the rest of our journey. But why now? And it's a almost funny question to ask in the midst of what we're going through right now in 2020, I think, because, when I first did a presentation like this a year or two ago, the answer was much of what I've already said about, being dedicated and committed to always embracing current research, to never being cooked, to always being innovative and curious. And so the answer is it is always the time to transform in that approach. But now I would say there's a much more radical reason, which is that um, many people talk about wanting to go back to normal. And I think, many of us in the youth development field have no desire to go back to normal. We definitely want to go back to being in person with children, but we see this as an opportunity to transform what has been often, at best, weak systems and at worst, toxic systems of managing children and of moving children along through a pipeline rather than cultivating resilience and strength and joy. And we believe that now is a time when we can actually rebuild something in a completely new way, in a progressive way, in a way that values children as humans and not as producers of grades or future participants in the workforce, but as humans now who deserve not only to survive what they're going through, but to find the creative practice that they'll thrive with, to find their passion for meaningful work, to find the skills and capacities to help them be successful in family and relationships. And so, it's so trite to say now more than ever, but I really do feel that way at this point under these circumstances. So what I want to do next is play you a short video. This is actually just the trailer for a film called Resilience, which you can find online and watch the whole thing, I believe, if you're interested. But I think it's a good way of showing just what we mean by trauma. And so I'm going to remember now to disconnect my Bluetooth and go to full screen. Oops.
We all like to think of childhood as this time of joy and innocence. But, for many of us, it's just not true.
When you grow up in these type of situations, it's not something you talk about. I know I did it.
The first thing that we found is that adverse childhood experiences are common.
Kids are young, they don't know what's going on, they won't remember anyway. Well, the child may not remember, but the body remembers.
There was this incredible gee whiz effect. You mean adverse childhood experiences cause heart disease and lung disease and liver and cancer?
Exposure to trauma affects children's developing brains. The impact is on your behavior, it's on your heart, it's on your DNA. Like, how do you deal with all that?
I don't reach out because I'm not used to that.
We have a whole new body of knowledge now that could open up what we have up till now been seen as intractable, unsolvable problems.
No child should be punched or kicked. No child should be punched or kicked.
If you can get the science into the hands of the general population, they will invent very wise actions.
Do you feel like any of the interventions have been making a difference?
They made all the difference in the world.
It's there, it's possible. And a defeatist attitude is completely disconnected from what 21st century science is telling us. And we should be going after that like a bear.
So I'm gonna, oops, sorry. Okay. Okay. Yeah, great. So I thought that short piece really sums it up, that what we're talking about now about trauma, while it does refer to experiences that can cause intense physical and or psychological reactions, it doesn't necessarily just refer to a single event. It can refer to a single event, but it can be multiple events. It can be sets of circumstances that's experienced by an individual as physically and emotionally harmful or threatening, and that it has lasting adverse effects on physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. That trauma is not just something that we experience and put behind us that either destroys us or makes us stronger. It's something that when we experience, both as individuals and as communities, that we carry it with us. And one of the really compelling aspects of this that I really didn't know anything about when we started this journey was the epigenic aspect of it, meaning that you pass trauma through generations, that trauma can actually change your DNA and you can pass it along. And that was, I think, for many of us, when we got into the science of that, it was both surprising that it's literally true and also felt true for many of us who feel that we carry trauma, that we don't know where it comes from, right? And that it comes from historical and community trauma, as well as family and individual. And that this is something that is universal, that we all carry with us. But as one would expect, it's also some of us carry it much more than others, and that there are factors, and especially poverty and economics and race, that that play into that in a major way, and we'll get into that a little bit. So I want to stop here for a moment, and I'll go back to my screen share. And how do I get, here we go. Okay. Not sure what's happening right now, but I'm going to figure this out. And I'm going to ask you to consider, what does this mean for you? So many of you have a lot of experience with this already. Many of you come with expertise, have been through training. Some of you may be hearing some of this stuff for the first time. And before we even get any deeper into the research, what does this mean for you? And how have you already considered what trauma-informed practice means for your work? How have you been considering what this movement, what this research, what these ideas mean for your work? And in order for us to really be able to share with each other, we're going to take a few minutes in breakout rooms. So Armando, whenever you're ready, unless Stu or Armando have any questions you want to raise right now before we dive into the breakout rooms.
Thanks, Eric. Just one thing, as you enter into your breakout, probably be 3 or 4 people. You take just a moment, introduce yourself, and then you can just go right in, whoever wants to start and address the question. And Eric, we'll have it in the chat. Would you just mention the question one more time?
Sure. So what does this mean for you? And how have you already considered what trauma-informed practice means for your work?
Okay. Mondo, anything?
It's already in the chat. You're going to be in breakout rooms of 3. There's one group of 4. Eric, Ginger, Stu, and Therese. You guys are all in room 1 together. Just go ahead and exit out of it once you go in there. But everybody else, go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and open up the rooms. I will message you when you have about 60 seconds left in the breakout rooms. We have 5 minutes in total for this breakout. So enjoy your breakouts. And if you need any assistance or help, go ahead and message me and I'll definitely assist you as much as I can. So have fun.
Thank you, Mano. Enjoy, everyone.
I would love to hear from just a couple of people, something that struck you about the conversation that you just had in your breakout room, or something you shared that you'd like to share with the whole group, about, what this means to you and how you've already been considering trauma-informed practice in your work. And, we'll keep the comments relatively brief, and we'll just take a few, but it would be nice to be able to hear from you as a group and hear what the breakout rooms we're talking about. Anybody want to be brave and unmute yourself and share?
And if you also want to put your hand up in the chat room and we'll call on
Sure.
you from there.
Yeah, sure. Liliana, go ahead. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Liliana Espino. I'm an AmeriCorps Vista for LA's Best. And I learned about resiliency when I was training to be a program worker for LA's Best. And so as a program worker, I was going to be the student's coach. And one of the things that that stuck with me, or something that I put into practice right away, was basically, there was one question. So this is what happened. There was one question I asked the kids: what do you want to be when you grow up? And this kind of ties in with what Eric Gurna just said about, we're not trying to make not producers of grades or future workforce employees. I asked them, what do you want to be when you grow up? And there was one student that said, I want to be a luchador of lucha libre. And he asked me, how do I translate that into English? And so I explained to him, and this is a student that's in like 4th grade. And I explained to him, well, it's something very specific to the Spanish culture, to the Mexican culture, and it doesn't really translate into English. So you can keep it in Spanish. And so I taught him how to write it in Spanish, and he shared it with his parents. He came back to me the next day. He's like, Coach Lily, I shared it with my mom and dad, and they loved it. And so that made me really happy. So instead of going after this student and saying like, no, that's not a real job, why don't you pick something else? I encouraged him to stick with what he had said, what he wanted to be. And that in a way builds that resiliency, because it allows them to, one, believe in themselves, and also encourage them that they can follow whatever they want to be. And so that's my tidbit on resiliency.
Thank you. And you're sort of foreshadowing what we're going to talk about in a few minutes too, which is looking at some of the elements of what trauma resilient expanded learning looks like. And part of it is just as simple as what you just said of children, of seeing each child and making sure that they know that they're seen. Yeah. Thank you, Liliana. Would someone else like to share as well? Erendita?
Hi, my name is Serendina. I'm a site coordinator for LA's Best in the Hollywood area. Something that we talked about in our break room, was about kind of how do we deal, or like how this is all important to us, to the work that we do. Because at times, we talked about that trauma that kind of travels, some of these kids, we don't know what the trauma is. They don't even know themselves. The parents might not know. It's something that kind of just has been going on. And, back in the days, we used to get a lot of, oh, he's just bad, or he just doesn't like to do this, or she just, so it's kind of now, especially with everything going on, it's like, how do we kind of work together? How to, without, being a therapist or a psychologist, how do we provide that safe environment for our kids?
Yeah, thank you. And that's also part of what this is about, is not characterizing children, right? But recognizing their needs. Yeah. Thank you both, my LA's Best family, for having my back and raising your hand too. Appreciate that. Now the rest of, there's a lot of LA's Best folks here I'm seeing. So someone who's not LA's Best, you got to represent and share. Ketsia, please.
Hi, I'm Ketsia. I work with school mental health here at LAUSD, and I was in a breakout room with a parent who was joining us from a different state. And we were just talking about really the importance of being mindful as we think about coming back after this shutdown, because of what a safe haven schools often are for children. And so the importance of really recognizing trauma in general, and just the role that school, both during school and after school, plays in really helping provide that support for children, and what a lack there is right now for many, many children.
Thank you. And I want to take this opportunity also to thank you, Ketsia, for your leadership at School Mental Health. You know, Ketsi and I spoke before Ginger and Teresa agreed to do this, and your enthusiastic support was really encouraging, and your work with Joel and Pia over there is such great leadership for us at LA's Best. And you know what you were just saying rings so true for me in our own breakout room. While you were in the breakout room, Stu was talking about just the societal and even global trauma that we're in the midst of right now, and that no one is exempt. And I heard someone say recently that people keep saying we're all in the same boat or something like that, and that we're not all in the same boat. We're on different boats in the same storm. And those boats may be really inequitable, but the storm's affecting us all. And as we begin to prepare to welcome children back into school and community, we don't even know the extent of the trauma that we've all experienced and that they've experienced. And so I think that this is a time of really important preparation for ourselves. And so we'll use that as a good bridge also to dive back into the material, just to talk a little bit about really specifically what we mean by trauma, in addition to what we already got from the little film clip and everything. There's a lot of different ways to talk about this. And so my apologies to the experts in the audience. I'm going to simplify it a little bit for my own brain. I've had to simplify this research so that I can grasp it and understand it, right? So there's really three big main categories of trauma. Acute trauma, which is basically from a single incident. Chronic trauma, which is repeated and occurs over a prolonged period of time. And complex trauma, which is exposure to various and multiple traumatic events. I'm going to share screen again to give you some examples of the types of trauma often encountered with our students, right? So these things are going to be familiar: bullying, community and domestic violence, early childhood trauma that's happened before they even join us in kindergarten or TK, medical trauma, refugee trauma, sexual abuse, and grief. And this all, you can get more information from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network about this. I'm breezing over a lot of really big, deep, complex, and sad things because I want to get to the constructive, strength-based part of this with enough time. But I'm not breezing over it because it's, petty or insignificant, and the distinctions between these types of trauma are important. Oops. What did I just do? Okay. So one thing that's important to look at is just what is the mechanism for how adverse childhood experiences, you'll often hear referred to as ACEs, not the funding source for after-school programs in California, that's after-school education and safety. This is adverse childhood experiences. So how do they influence health and well-being throughout the lifespan? Starting at the bottom of this, looking at adverse childhood experiences can often lead to disrupted brain development, to all kinds of impairments, cognitive, social, and emotional, which can then lead to adoption of risky behaviors, right? Choices that put ourselves at risk. That can be substances, that can be unsafe sexual behavior, that can be putting ourselves into situations where we're exposed to violence, and so many other things. And ultimately can lead to major health problems, disability, and even shorter lifespan. The research has shown that there's actually specific health issues that are associated with adverse childhood experiences. So anybody can go online, if you look at adverse childhood experiences quiz or survey, and you can actually find out what your ACEs score is. And it's rare that someone has no adverse childhood experiences at all. And many of us find that we have a higher ACEs score than we realize because there are things that we went through that we didn't consider trauma, that nobody recognized as trauma, that are actually considered adverse childhood experiences that have an impact, potentially an impact on our health. And remember, we're talking about public health research. So this is not deterministic for any individual. Many people are exceptions, but when we're looking at the data as an aggregate, we find that with higher ACEs scores comes higher substance misuse and addiction, higher health issues like obesity, depression and anxiety, earlier unwanted pregnancies, domestic abuse, even heart disease and cancer are associated with high ACEs scores. And this is where we get to what we mentioned earlier around equity, that yes, this is universal, and people in all backgrounds, walks of life, economic strata and all that deal with trauma and the effect of adverse childhood experiences. But we also know that there's a huge equity issue here, and that the students and families and communities that most of us are dedicated to serving are most at risk. So that includes low income, LGBT, QIA youth, students experiencing homelessness, students with developmental and intellectual disabilities, if there's substance abuse and other related issues in the home, and military and veteran families are most at risk. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are some big groupings. So now we actually can get to what I find to be the more inspirational aspect of this, right? Because we can take all that information and it can just be overwhelming and depressing, but we can transform that information into strength and into building stronger programs and helping equip kids to succeed. So what is a trauma-informed approach? Trauma-informed approach, first of all, understands and realizes the impact of ACEs and understands potential paths for healing, right? So we first have to take a clear-eyed look at this and not ignore the research, and not take a, well, I experienced all this stuff and I'm fine. Everybody needs to pull themselves up by their bootstraps approach, but to really understand that whether or not it's normalized, that adverse childhood experiences have an impact on the lifespan. So to realize that and recognize it, to be able to learn what are the signs and symptoms of trauma in our students and families and staff, in ourselves and others involved in our systems. And to respond by integrating that knowledge into policies and procedures and practices. So, one of my favorite quotes right now is that everybody wants change, but nobody wants to change, right? So everybody wants change, but nobody wants to change. And if we're gonna really dive into this, we have to be prepared to change our policies, to change our procedures and practices, to change how we talk, to change how we respond to situations, and to actively create conditions of compassion and engagement. So it's not just about the policies, the procedures, and the practices. It's really about looking to create program environments, school environments that actively cultivate compassion and engagement. And of course, that always starts with us as staff and as leaders. So what does this look like in expanded learning programs? We know we need to build staff awareness of trauma and its effects on young people. So that can be staff training, it can be materials we can produce, it can start in the hiring process and in staff orientation. We need to understand what competencies and skills foster resilience. And I'm gonna breeze through this a little bit because we're gonna get to some more depth on this. We need to create those new programs, practices, and policies and systems. Policy is only as good as it is enacted. It's not enough to focus so much on the policy language that we don't focus on how we actually put it into practice, and have a plan for ongoing learning and integration of trauma resilient informed practices. We're never going to get certified as a trauma informed program. We're always going to be on this journey towards becoming trauma informed, towards becoming trauma resilient. So I'm going to actually stop screen sharing for this one. We can share the deck if anybody's interested afterwards. I get a little bit tired of having only the slides up there, and I'm going to just talk about this one a little bit. Maybe because it's one of the things that's most exciting to me. That the question is, why expanded learning programs? Why are we such a great fit for this kind of approach? And it's because we've kind of been doing this all along. Most of this is not actually new to us. This is a chance to us to really embrace and deepen the work and to understand the why, right? Because when we understand, let me back up for a second. I think many of us who worked in after school programs for our whole careers, who worked in camps or other kinds of settings, we know intuitively that getting children in a circle where we can all see each other, talking about our day, talking about how we feel, calling children by their name, looking them in their eyes, really seeing them and helping them know that they're seen and heard. We know that that's important, and we don't need research and evidence to tell us that's important. But when we get research and evidence that tells us that that kind of connection can create a protective factor that can help carry them through their whole life, that can help them be more resilient to trauma that they've experienced or they will experience, even as they get older, that it can have an impact on their health, that having that protective factor can help them to be successful in their relationships. It deepens our why, right? And we know that it's not just important because it feels good, and we know we're doing something right for a child when we're looking them in the eye and making sure that they feel heard, but that the evidence, the science actually backs it up. That can fill our tanks with inspiration to be able to do this work even more, and to not mindlessly replicate the current schooling model, which might be always sitting in rows facing the teacher, or it might be simply focusing on the transfer of knowledge. Knowledge is important, but so is connection, so is social connection. And right now in the current situation, I would say that social connection is what children are being deprived of. And so we have to focus, it's what we should be focusing on almost exclusively. But we'll hear from Ginger and Therese more about that when we get into the conversation. So why expanded learning programs? We already have strong adult youth and relationships. We already have that focus. We already have an existing focus on social emotional learning, positive youth development framework. We have consistent time with students. We have the ability to cultivate a high degree of trust with children and families, which is critical for creating the conditions for resilience and everything we're talking about here. And we have programmatic flexibility to create spaces for healing and skill building, right? So we're not held to keeping on the scope and sequence of the curriculum. We can change. We have the space to change more quickly, more readily, and it's really just on us to decide how we change, because we don't have this set of standards being forced on us, and we haven't agreed to a set of standards that we're going to stick to every day for 1 hour, et cetera. We can change. We have that flexibility. And so I'm gonna pause for a second. Stu, is there anything that's come up that questions or anything like that that I should address?
No, I don't see any questions here in the chat.
Okay. Well, I'm going to assume that's because everybody is mesmerized with my eloquence and depth of knowledge. But I also want to encourage you to consider and reflect as we go. And if you do have questions that you want to share in the chat, please feel free to. Share screen. So, why does it always do that? Okay. So that's everything I just said. It's summarized there. If you're interested in that, we could share the deck. So looking at how we actually build healing and healthy development, this is not rocket science, right? We need to focus on holistic health, meaning every human, I was gonna say every child, but every human, we all need sleep, exercise, nutrition. That's like, if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's like at the bottom, right? We also need mindfulness. We need to be reflective. We need to be able to have solitude and a chance to reflect with ourselves and connect with ourselves. We need mental health. We need healthy relationships. And some of these, especially the bottom three, are really key for expanded learning programs to focus on. So what are the protective factors? And I mentioned this term earlier. Protective factors are the idea that there are certain elements that if children have it in their lives, that they are more likely to be resilient to trauma, that they're more likely to thrive amidst adversity, right? And so that can be high self-esteem. It can be learning how to regulate our emotions, feeling safe, having mentors, having those connections with adults and near peers who can help guide us, learning coping skills and problem-solving skills, engagement and connection with peers, and strong cultural and identity development. And if we had more time, what I'd be asking now is for you to really consider and share with your peers the ways that your program is already doing these things. Because it's really important for me that we all recognize that most of us are attempting to do most of these things already. And that what's useful about learning that the research shows that these things develop protective factors is that we can give new importance to these things. Like I was saying earlier about the circle, that we can we can do assessment and evaluation as we've been doing with Professor Tiffany Berry at Claremont University to look at how we build protective factors. What are we good at already? Where do we need to grow? And focusing in on our strengths so that we can really do even more and we can get better at developing the protective factors that we are currently developing. So all of this information, learning all of this, led us to strive to become the nation's first large-scale trauma-resilient expanded learning system. So while there are individual programs doing amazing things, and there are systems making some efforts towards trauma resilience and trauma-informed practice, LA's Best has really been trying to become a system that is trauma-informed. And so let's talk for a minute about what that means to be a system that's trauma-informed, because I want to get practical now. One of the things, and I'm gonna come back to the slide in a minute so I can not be sharing screen. There we go. One of the things that we realized is that we needed more capacity. We needed the ability to do really strong expert professional development. We needed to support our staff when they're dealing with crises. We needed to be more responsive, and we needed to have a stronger bridge to expert resources like LAUSD School Mental Health, County Mental Health, and others. And so we created a position of LA's Best Mental Health Consultant. And at first we just had one, and now we have two, and you're gonna hear from Ginger and Therese in a couple minutes. They are psychiatric social workers who work out of LAUSD School Mental Health, but are assigned full-time to being LA's Best Mental Health Consultants. So it's a bridge position between the school district mental health department and the LA's Best program, part of the LA's Best leadership team, who can, on a daily basis, support our staff who are dealing with so many incidents and crises and help them, not by providing direct counseling to children and families, but by supporting our staff in how to respond to those situations in a way that is as supportive as possible. Not just following the protocols we need to follow. We all need to do that. We need to be really good at it. But going beyond that to be as supportive as possible. And then also working with our staff development department to build staff development that teaches about trauma-informed practice and integrates this work into staff orientation and into all of our different staff trainings, our online staff training and all of that. And that really builds a trauma-resilient informed after-school workforce. We've also sort of almost launched a pilot with UCLA several times. We keep getting stopped from various factors that get in our way, the most recent one being the pandemic. But the idea of a pilot project is to work with just a couple of schools to do some intensive work with our after-school staff and also the school staff there to improve trauma screening, prevention, family engagement, really look at what practices could we take system-wide. And we had the schools all picked out and the principal approval and Ginger and Therese ready to work with our staff development department in those schools. And then COVID-19 hit and we had to sort of put that on hold. We've been working with Dr. Angela Venegas, who was with UCLA and is now with Charles Drew University, and with Trisha Lester and Cheryl Karaoka at UCLA, who are experts in this field. And really, I want to report to you, have discovered the potential of expanded learning and after school and see all of the factors that we mentioned earlier about why we're a good fit for this work and want to take their expertise and support us. And we haven't always seen that in after school. We sometimes have been an afterthought, and we're now feeling like we're much more fully at the table with these experts, and it's really exciting to see that. So I'm feeling kind of talked out. So I'm gonna skim through a couple of slides that we're gonna just send you. And then we're going to get to our conversation. So Therese and Ginger, you have like your 2-minute warning to your moment in the spotlight here. I'm going to go back to share my screen, but I have too many slides. So this report that Mary Jo Ginty and LACO supported, we can send out to everybody who participated in this. It included recommendations for the field based on not just what LA's Best is doing, but what we saw nationally. And I'm not going to get into the details here. I'm going to say that we need to build capacity on all levels in order to be able to really embrace trauma-informed work. We need to foster partnerships. This is not about after-school programs becoming mental health providers or suddenly having like massive expertise. There's an existing trauma-informed movement. There are existing resources in our communities that we can connect to, and we need to get better at doing that. So we need to foster partnerships, and we need to elevate self-care. And I would say this is also more true than ever in the current situation that we're in. You know, it's the old sort of metaphor of you've got to put your own oxygen mask on before you can help others. It's not just that we need to care for ourselves so we have the capacity to care for others. We also need to care for ourselves so that we model caring for oneself to the children that we work with and to our peers, right? So this is about elevating self-care in our programs and in ourselves. And we need to create field-specific resources. There are unique aspects of expanded learning, of after-school programs, of summer programs, and we need curriculum, materials, guidance that are specific to our field. So
Eric, can I ask a question, Eric?
Please.
Eric? Yes, there's a comment coming in from Elle from Sanford Harmony, and she's asking, can they have access, folks on the webinar today, to the evaluation research that you're referencing, and how could they get access to that?
Yeah, so we can easily send out the LACO LA's Best report that summarizes all of this, gets into depth on some of these recommendations, and we can also send out. There's a Medium piece. Stu and Armando, when we create a summary of this, there's a Medium.com piece that has more depth, more references, and I'm glad that that question came from Sanford Harmony, because Sanford Harmony is actually one of our key partners in social emotional learning. They've provided no-cost resources to LA's Best and many, many other programs and schools across the country that have helped us so much with giving tools to our staff to help them play games, have conversations with children, connect with each other. You know, it's hard going in there as a, let's say, 20-year-old staff member, full of compassion and talent, but not necessarily training in how to facilitate social emotional learning activities. And Sanford Harmony has provided great activities. And I'll say that one of the key things there has been their flexibility. It's not about implementing their program. I see Daniel Monterosa from LA's Best nodding, because this is a, I don't know if you've experienced this at your program, but at LA's Best, we've had partners who have great curriculum and great programs. But if they're looking for us to implement their program without modifying it and adapting it and making it fit with us, it doesn't usually work. But if they come in with resources that we can adapt, we can use some, not use others, and they can work with us and support us to make it our own, that's when it really works. And that's when it can sustain. And Sanford Harmony has been an excellent example of that. And did I mention that they've been providing resources at no cost? So I'm happy to do a shameless plug for something that doesn't cost you anything. I get a big commission out of the nothing that you have to pay them. And they've moved a lot of their resources online. Even before the pandemic hit, they were moving a lot of resources online. So definitely recommend checking out Sanford Harmony, and thanks for that question. Any other questions or anything, Stu, before we move into some small group conversation?
Sounds good. That was it.
So I want to ask you to take another breakout session. Actually, wait a minute. I'm skipping. Actually, I want to wait on the breakout session because you're going to have more to draw from if we wait on the breakout session until after we have a conversation with Ginger and Therese. So before I introduce them, I just want to say that the background on this is that, this is a pretty smooth PowerPoint presentation and everything. I've used this at a conference, a few conferences. And so when Sam asked me to do this webinar, I was happy to present this material. I'm super enthusiastic about it. It's really meaningful to me. Feels personal, and it feels like something that I want to share with others. But I said, I don't feel capable of addressing what all this means under this pandemic and under, forced homeschooling, what I've come to call forced screen addiction, forced isolation, right? That we're all experiencing, and that the children we serve are experiencing in very intense ways. I don't feel closely connected enough to the experience that our families and communities are having right now in the circumstances to speak to it competently. And I don't like to BS a crowd. So that's when I wanted to invite Ginger and Therese to join me. And they have been, since this COVID-19 pandemic hit, Ginger and Therese and their colleagues with Ketsia and under the leadership of Joel at School Mental Health, have been working the LAUSD School Mental Health Hotline. And they've been doing training with district staff for how to cope right now and how to support children and families and communities to prepare for welcoming children back to school and community. And so they're much more closely connected. They have much more expertise than I do. And I'm really, honored to call them colleagues. And basically what I wanted to do is sort of interview them a little bit with you listening in. As I'm asking Ginger and Therese questions, I'm very open to taking questions from you as participants as well. So please don't be shy about putting a question in the chat, and then we can hear from you directly then too, or Stu can relay the question so you can participate as well. So Ginger and Therese, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really happy that you were able to make the time and happy to have your expertise and experience.
Thank you for having us. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm glad to be able to speak to our peers really who are working with kids in the schools and after school program and who are working with us with this pandemic. It's great that people want to know how to work with our families, work with our parents, work with our kids during this time.
Thank you. So the first question I want to ask you is just like very open. What's going on with children and families right now? What are you hearing? What are you learning about what families are going through and the kinds of supports that they're looking for?
You want to be the first one, Therese, to answer? Or
go for it, Ginger.
Scissors this?
Yeah.
It's definitely the initial phase of when we started the hotline. It used to be the crisis hotline, now it's the LAUSD wellness hotline. I think it was in around March or April, the big problem was how are we coping with, with this situation. I now have my kid in front of me and I don't know how to teach my kid. My kid doesn't know how to log on. And I think over time, it became more of, I did see the shift over the summer. It became more of, you talk about Maslow's hierarchy of need. It's basically, where do I get my next food? Where do I get my rent? Where do I get? So it's really now bare bones to the basic needs. And I think it's just sort of like evolved now into we're having calls about having to do suicide assessment. That has jumped. I want to say yesterday alone, I was on call in the morning from 8 to 12:30 and I spoke too soon. I actually said, usually in the morning, we don't get a lot of calls. I had a call every hour and it went down from my husband is about to get deported. He's our sole provider. What do? We need an attorney to talk to them, to talk to us. My child locked herself up in the bathroom and is talking about wanting to hurt herself. And down to my daughter is homeless and we need a shelter. So it's now this array of open door of every single basic needs problem that are basically happening. So I think the pandemic has just added another layer to a stressor, to a trauma that's already existing. And it's almost just like, can it get any worse? Yes, here you go, here's a pandemic, and now this is how the community, and it's not just, it's all of us, but then a lot of us are pretty privileged, right? We're looking around, we're in our home, we have internet access. We're pretty blessed in that sense, but the kids and the family and the community, and I'm gonna say the community only because we get a lot of people calling that are not LAUSD students or staff or parents. We're getting people all around LA County. I got a call from Texas because they heard in their news that we have this help hotline. And I had to do a child abuse report in Texas two weeks ago. So they're coming from all over the place, and it gets really overwhelming, I'll be honest with you.
Exactly. And one of the things that I think people may be surprised about is that it's across cultures, it's across races. It's not just one culture, even though we have a majority of Latinos in our school district. We're getting calls from African Americans, Asians, white people, everyone is calling. And the hotline, you think, like Ginger said, you think they'd be calling just about mental health issues. That is not so. And what I've found also is the majority of calls are from teachers and staff more than the students. You think the students will be calling? Usually it's the parents. They're calling, parents call and say, I want to talk about, Johnny. But what ends up happening is they're calling really for themselves, but they don't want to say it. They're having meltdowns. They're in crisis, but they present it as though it's for their child. And so we're getting it where people are resistant to accepting they're in crisis, but they're still calling. And they need the help. They want the help. They want to talk to somebody, and then they want the support. So I think it's important that when we receive a call, not just the hotline, if you all are hearing from parents, you all are hearing from students, listen not only with your ears, listen with the body language. Listen to what's not being said. That's very, very important, because that's what's happening. Even on the calls we're getting, we have to be aware of what's not being said as well as what's being said.
How do you do that? How do you listen to what's not being said? How in a time of, when you're only talking to people on a hotline, like how do you, you're talking about body language, but you might just be on the phone. Like, I feel like we're so, I don't want to say disabled, that's not quite the right word, but we have so many challenges towards being able to really hear and connect with parents and families even when they are taking that step to express a need for help. So how do we do that? So
that's part of tone. So I can be talking like this, yes, or I can say, I'm not really, or yes, I'm really fine. Tone, we have to be able to read tone. Or we can ask, we can say, what does that mean for you? A lot of times we interpret what people mean by our own experience. But what we have to do is, what does that mean for you? What is that? Where is that going to take you? What do you want me to take away from this? So it depends on what you're asking, as well as how you're asking it, what they're saying, as well as how they're saying it. So when you're listening to everything. And then for those of you who are on Zoom, you also want this, that's the visual part. Even though you're on Zoom, and it can be very challenging. Don't get me wrong, this is not easy at all. You still want to look at body language on Zoom. You still want to see how they're connecting with you, how they're not connecting with you.
So
I'm
sorry, go ahead, Ginger.
We also have to be aware too, I was just reading, Debbie wrote on the chat, how can you talk about how staff are impacted? I think with the LA, specifically, I'm going to speak about the after school program staff that are in the trenches. They need a lot of support too. I think we went in here with all hands on deck from the beginning. How can we help? Debbie going out and just advocating for us. Where do you need us? LAUSD, and sent everybody out. But I think over time, when we went in there with that kind of thinking, we forgot to check in on our staff too. When, over summer, that's when it sort of like started unraveling themselves, where our staff are really struggling,
So just to give a little bit of background there, currently LA's Best, as part of Beyond the Bell, is doing a huge food distribution effort, right? There's about currently over 400,000 meals being distributed across the city at 63 grab and go sites every day. We're helping to run the district's COVID testing program, right? We're doing some limited in-person supervision of district personnel, children on school campuses, and as well as virtual engagement, right? Which has been going on for a while in an asynchronous way and is sort of slowly but surely going to start in a synchronous way. And so while a lot of people have been working from home and schools are closed, so people are like, well, after school programs are closed, many of us at LA's Best, and of course, many other programs, our staff are actively out there, right? Working in community and working in situations of some risk, right? I mean, while everything is being done to keep them safe and protected, being out there in the world right now brings some risk with it and some fear that comes along with that. So Ginger and Therese, could you talk a little bit more about how we need to support our own staff? Let's start with, in this current situation, which we don't know how long this crisis is going to go. And then we can talk a little bit about the next phase of things as well and how we need to support them. But how do we support staff in this current crisis?
Since we're in the topic of trauma informed, one of the ways that they advocate for and being trauma informed would be a simple check-in. Check to see where's everybody at. Whether we do that once a week, whether we do that within our pods, within the cluster, within our group, within the region. But that is something that we need to actually put in our practice. And I think right now it's kind of hard to do that sometimes because, when we're inside the office, we can sort of like, I'm only going to speak for LA's Best. We're sort of like in this close quarter that I'm checking in on you because I'm the first person you pass through in our little cubicle. So we're constantly checking in, but now we almost have to be intentional for that. And it's so basic, but yet it's something that we miss because we're thinking big all the time. And as another simple thing too is the conversation of self-care. Teresa and I know that you mentioned that our staff did the training and utilizes Sanford and Harmony, but last year, this LA's Best is actually one of the only groups that at LAUSD that she actually made it mandatory for our staff to do the psychological first aid training versus for everybody else in the school district, it's sort of like an option for them to do, but we were proactive, and psychological first aid is an actual evidence-based practice where it's a tool that you could use when a crisis has taken place, whether there's a natural disaster, a death, or definitely we're going to be using this once we when we go back to school. But every year we're doing this training, and over the summer, Daniel actually did a little clip with us. He filmed this, again, advocating about psychological first aid. And the number one thing that psychological first aid talks about is if you're not okay, it's really hard for you to do this work. So it goes back to checking in with one another. This can no longer be a top-down approach where we're just helping the kids. It's literally me talking to you, me checking in with Debbie, me checking in with our coworkers, and then we check in with the staff, and then we check in with the kids. Because at the end of this, again, if you're not okay, this is not going to happen. This is not going to work. And I think that's what's happening now with our parents, right? Parents are now realizing like, oh my God, this is what the teachers are seeing in the classroom.
So I want to add to that. Ginger mentioned checking in, but let's deal with the reality. Is it safe to check in? Some of our staff may not want to check in because how is it going to reflect on them? How is my supervisor going to respond to it? Am I going to be penalized? That's really the reality. I had mentioned to Ketsia at some point in the past that I was working with a couple of staff people, and I'm talking about confidentiality. I thought I knew what I was going on, and I actually forgot our confidentiality is limited even with staff. I think about limited confidentiality with students, but I don't think about limited confidentiality with staff. So how are they really feeling safe, saying, telling their bosses or their supervisors, their peers, how it is? So how do we check in, have them be honest, and deal with whatever may happen, whatever may be said? How do we tell them that? How do we allow them to feel safe to check in, but also know that our confidentiality is limited and there may be some things we have to do? So that's the balance that's going to be challenging for us as well.
Well, I think that becomes where the top management has to be aligned with with everybody, right? So it's not like feeling like, well, I can't talk to Eric because Eric is sort of like aligned with Debbie. So I might have to go to the next person, so then they can then relay my information to Eric or Debbie. But that's something that as a group, we have to decide. We can't function as a high, almost like this strict hierarchy, because then no one's going to feel safe to share, to talk, or to ask. A couple of weeks ago, I don't know when this was, and we actually had a staff call in and tell us that her doctor told her she needs to go to the emergency room and she needs to be assessed to be admitted. She waited 24 hours. I get this email at 10 o'clock at night. Of course, I don't see it until 7 o'clock in the morning. And when I called her, she said, I was told to do this, but I was so afraid that I might lose my job. What do I do? And I was just like, oh my God, you march yourself to the nearest ER. We don't function that way. I just go, and I think that's a lot of ours. Like, I can only imagine who else is feeling that way.
So you both raise a real big issue that goes beyond any one organization, right? So we can, just taking the example of LA's Best, but apply it to your organization, we can do our best to embrace positive attitudes about mental health and holistic approaches at the leadership of our organization. And we can do it at the school district. Ginger and Therese are supported by Ketia as a supervisor, and Ketia is supported by Joel as director of school mental health, and by Pia as director of that whole division, and by the superintendent and the school board. But we all exist in a culture that stigmatizes seeking assistance and support for mental health, right? And so I think that it's important to realize that we're part of if we join this trauma-informed movement, we're part of a larger movement, which is about destigmatizing seeking support for mental health. I mean, imagine, Ginger, the story that you just told, but replace dental for mental, right? So I had a dental emergency, and my dentist told me, you got to get to the emergency room to get this looked at, and you might have to be admitted for procedure. But I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job, right? We would find it absurd, right? And I mean, I'll just say right now, like, sort of taking the wind out of my own sails a little bit, but just looking around at the Zoom, raise your hand if in the last, let's say, year, you've had to seek the support of a dentist, dental, you had a teeth cleaning, or you had to get a filling, or something like that, right? Okay. What about vision care? Has anybody had to get a new eye exam or prescriptions or anything like that? Okay. Now, imagine if I asked, what about mental health? Has anyone who's seeing a therapist, I'm not asking, who's had an urgent need to seek support for a mental health crisis, any of those kinds of things? It would be, even now in this group where it's as safe as probably can be, and as destigmatized as can be, given the topic that we're focusing on, it would be considered inappropriate for me to ask that. And it would be very uncomfortable for most of us. Even just to say, I got to leave early on Thursday, I have a therapist appointment, right? That would be very unusual to be that open. And it wouldn't at all be it wouldn't at all be unusual to say that if you have a dentist appointment, right? So we're part of a movement that's about making mental health and getting support for mental health on a reactive way if you have a crisis or an immediate need, and a preventative ongoing way by doing therapy and other forms of support, totally acceptable, right? And we've got a long way to go. And there's a lot of cultural stigma just across the board. It comes up specifically in different cultural groups, right? But it comes up in almost every one. And it certainly comes up as, in society as a whole. So Ginger and Therese, like, how can we, as organizations, as schools, as school districts, as systems, create more safety for staff like the one that you just mentioned, Ginger?
I've been thinking a lot about that, especially just like 30 minutes ago. Debbie's laughing because we're in a situation right now.
Well, share as much as you'd like, Ginger. I don't want to put you on the spot, but when you say you're in a situation right now, it exemplifies exactly what we're going through. So not putting you on the spot, you don't have to share anything, but it just shows how much this work is present.
We have
and ongoing.
When you were in the middle of your presentation, Eric, I don't know if you saw me, I was just like talking on the phone. We have a staff that we actually need to have, I think it's either the MET team, the school psychiatric team, to go out and assess this person at one of our sites. So it's happening all the time. And it's almost just like, again, that whole check-in, how does that work? Especially when, it's so hard with the after school world because there's so limited time where we have access to our staff, right? And I learned this lesson because I a couple of weeks ago, the same person said, I think we need to talk to my staff. And I said, great, let's do it at 4, let's do it at 3 o'clock, I'm free. And she's like, well, our staff is actually working during the day and we don't really can do it in the afternoon. So it's even the timing becomes a little bit more tricky. So again, it goes back to being intentional, right? How do we push it that this is an important thing, that we make time to do this, we carve it out of our schedule, or else it's never gonna happen because something else we assume would be bigger needs to take place. And like what you said, almost sometimes like mental health or the need to ask for help is sort of like the last thing. It's kind of like with parents, how, I was a clinician for a long time. And I remember when I would have clients come in and I would check in with the parents, and most of the time parents would say like, yeah, but worry about my kid. But then the reality is, well, let's really check in on you first. What do you need? Because once we handle that, then we can work on your child who at the end of the day, really, they're looking at you for support.
Exactly. Yeah, there's no such thing as children's mental health without family mental health, right?
Right, for sure, for sure.
Exactly.
Sorry, Therese, please.
Our staff comes in and we're here for the kids. We want to be here for the kids. I think we need to rethink not just being here for the kids. We have to be there for each other. But what does that look like? We spend a lot of time with each other at work as well as at home. And so I know when I first came to LA's Best, I had all these posters around saying, you're part of the family, you're part of the family. Well, what does that mean? What does that look like? How am I part of the family? How do I feel safe enough to be able to say the things and feel the things the way I do? So the work environment also needs to change in that. And I know you mentioned earlier, people want change without changing, right? Mm-hmm. So we're here for the kids, we're here for the parents, are we here for each other as well? And that's what's going to make the difference, I think, in when we're talking about checking in and looking at each other and making sure we're okay. How are we here for each other? What does that look like? And is it okay that, it may not look the way we think it does, but this is the best we can do right now. But something has to happen. What is that?
So I see, Deanne, you made a comment in the chat about that it's all about relationships, staff to students, students to staff, and staff to staff. We have a lot of work to do around building relationships and making connections. Deanne, putting you on the spot if you choose to speak, but putting it out there to everybody, what does that work around building relationships and making connections really look like? Like, how do we do that work, and how do we create space and time, as Ginger was referencing, to be able to do that work?
I think time is the big key but if we don't stop and slow down and make it a priority for us, it's never going to happen. For example, in Ellie's Best, we do grounding exercises prior to us going into meetings. So I may be grouped in a meeting where I don't know somebody as well as I would if I didn't spend 3-6 minutes in a group talking about, what's your favorite hobby? What do you do? That's a building ground to getting to know someone. That could lead to other conversations and building a relationship. But if we don't give the space or time to that, we're doing ourselves a disservice. And when you hear things in the space, I love the thing that I can't remember who said it. I don't know if it was a Therese, is how do you listen to what's not said?
Mm.
And people when they show up to space, they're peppy, they're rocking it, they're talkative, and all of a sudden somebody's quiet and showing up a little different. Poke around a little bit. Hey, you all right? Everything cool? Just checking in on you. If you hear something in a space or in a room, call them, pick up the phone. Hey, thanks so much for sharing. I totally understand you. This is what has helped me. Or, I can't even understand what you're going through. I'm so sorry, but I'm here for you.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't give yourself space and your organization doesn't allow that space, or we don't value it, that's going to hurt us. And we need to have that space and time.
Thank you, Deanne. And I want to draw that out a little bit more too, that to the systems level, right? So we can choose to create time in a meeting to do our check-ins and have time to build that relationship. But we also need more time for investing in our staff, right? That we're set up in a way, the way our grants work for most of us in these programs, where our staff who work directly with children, we only have the funds to pay them when they're with the kids, right? And so if we want to really invest in the opportunity for them to connect with each other, learn from each other, to do staff development for trauma-informed practices and mental health first aid and all these things we're talking about, we need additional support, right? We can't just conjure up that time and space because we don't have the money to do it many times. And that's why we're grateful to, like I mentioned, Kaiser Permanente and Keck Foundation earlier, Pritzker Foundation, who's been interested in this work and supporting UCLA's aspect of it, that these foundations can invest in the field of after school to be able to give us more time and space to invest in our own staff. And that's not just about service delivery for children. It's about the investment in the staff for its own sake, right? And the thousands of young adults all across the state who work in after school programs who need that resources and support themselves so that they can pass it on to the children they work with, but also so that they can be more whole for their own families and their own communities. So that's maybe a little bit of a shameless plug for any funders or people with influence on funders out there, that if we don't have the resources to invest in our staff, then all this content, it usually tends to exist only at the leadership level because we just can't roll it out and really, really execute. So I see there's a question from Regino in the chat. Regino, do you want to just ask Ginger and Therese yourself instead of me reading it?
No, it's actually bigger than Ginger and Therese, but you just addressed it. We may be very proactive in terms of the organizational culture, but there are structures above us, beyond us, right, including the funding, that interfere with staff getting the help that they need. So,
yeah, thank you for that. And I would say, with your expertise in evaluation, like I would say, there's also the aspect of how we define success, right? And that if we're looking to be defined by specific academic outcomes or specific skill building that's more easily measured, then we're going to be limited in our capacity to do this more holistic work. And if we can define ourselves in success in holistic terms, then we can invest in that holistic development, right? But it's sort of a catch-22 because it's much easier to measure things like scores and grades than it is to measure the holistic human development or prevention, you know, investing in a child so that they don't make an unhealthy choice later. It's very hard to measure that. But it's something that we're all, I think, obligated to try to measure so that we can define success on our own terms. So I want to thank Ginger and Therese for this ongoing conversation. I'm learning a lot and really enjoy how open you are with sharing your day-to-day experience. And I want to shift now to some small group work. There's been a lot of food for thought here. And I want to ask you to break into small groups in a moment and talk about how can we apply these understandings and ideas to our own work? How can we really take all of this and what does it look like in our own work? And Armando, I think we could use a couple more minutes than we did on the last breakout room so that each person really has a chance to, you know, introduce themselves a little more thoroughly in terms of what they're doing in their work, and talk about how we apply these understandings and ideas. So maybe, I don't know, like maybe 8 minutes, something like that. Does that sound good?
That works.
Great. Okay. So I know we're going to put it in the chat, but how can we apply these understandings and ideas to our work? We'll take a few minutes and then come back as a whole group.
Sounds good. Again, you're going to be in groups of 3 or 4. Again, and I just got a message from someone that they're stepping off to move out. Let me just double check if I could find her quickly. Let me see. Just don't accept the invite if you have to leave quickly, okay? All right, here we go. I'm gonna go ahead and open the rooms. Eric, you wanna share the question one more time?
Sure, it's how can we apply these understandings and ideas to our work?
Perfect. I'm opening up the rooms.
Well, thank you, everybody. I wish that I could be in a room and overhear the small group conversations. Unfortunately, that doesn't work on Zoom. And without any pressure to share, is there anybody that has anything that they're really burning to share from their small group with the whole group here? Okay. I know we were just talking about how this part can be a little awkward on Zoom. Yeah, Michelle, did you have something you wanted to share?
Yeah, thank you, Eric. So I'm Michelle with Ellie's Best. And, you know, something I wanted to share about my group, I just thought it was interesting just how everyone has, you know, different reality. We all just shared a little bit of our story and what we're currently dealing with. And so it was just interesting to see we all have a different story, we all have a different reality. And now just thinking about everyone we work with has a different story, has a different background, has a different reality. And so I think it's just important to just always approach the work from a place of understanding and curiosity and wanting to learn more so that we know where everyone is coming from or what everyone's reality is, and just learn a little bit more so we know how to support and how to just meet their needs. So I just want to thank my group for sharing a little bit about their story and, you know, just listening and being there for each other.
Thank you, Michelle. And Elle, you raised your hand?
Yes, I had the privilege of speaking with Rendida, who's a site supervisor now, but she shared all the different roles that she's played through LA's Best since April. And it's a huge variety of responses of things that she's done, been tasked with and carried out. And what came through to me is how amazing LA's Best has been in response to this crisis. I mean, it still brings, almost made me weep with appreciation for the love and caring that you've brought to the community. Instead of just saying, I've got this thing and here, you can have this, it's evident that you've really responded to what are the needs, what does my community need, and what can we do? Rendida is such an amazing woman, and what she has played and what she's done for this community through your services. It's awesome.
Thank you, Elle. I really appreciate that. And I want to give a shout out to Debbie Loxton and the whole LA's Best operations team here who has carried that off incredibly over the last several months. But also want to say that we're part of a community of programs, and that this is not just LA's Best and Beyond the Bell, but every program, every after school program that's represented in this group, and all the other programs that didn't join us today in Los Angeles and across the state, are really showing that the work of youth development is not about service provision. It's about serving community, and that we may be changing. We didn't expect to be doing helping manage medical testing or distributing all this food or doing work online. The vehicle may be changing, but the social connection, the connecting with other people, connecting with our community, is really consistent with our years and years of history. And if you ever visited one of the food distribution sites, for example, or any of the food distribution that any of our programs have done, privately and with the school district across the city, you see that it's food that's being given out, but it's also food as a vehicle for love and community connection and warmth and encouragement and solidarity. And I've been so inspired the couple times I've got to visit, because the food is absolutely essential, but that solidarity and connection is just as essential. And so I'm incredibly grateful, and thank you, Al, for seeing that in that way. I want to make sure that we have time for a closing bit. So before we get into a couple of good announcements that we have, I'm going to share my screen one more time. Before I do, I want to just say, I want to share a quote with you. And the reason I'm sharing it with you is because one of the things that trips me up about this whole trauma-informed stuff is that saying the word trauma so much, it feels negative. It feels deficit-based. And in after school and youth development, we're all about building strengths and being asset-based, right? And we don't want to focus entirely on the difficulties. We want to focus on the talents and charm and joy and creativity of our children and our staff. And Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who is now the California Surgeon General, but has been a leader in this movement for many years. She wrote a book called The Deepest Well, which I highly recommend to everybody. And in that, she talks about this, that there's really two sides of the coin. She says the long-term impacts of childhood adversity are not all suffering. In some people, adversity can foster perseverance, deepen empathy, strengthen the resolve to protect, and spark many superpowers. But in all people, it gets under our skin and into our DNA, and it becomes an important part of who we are. To me, this is so critical that we realize that our journeys and our stories and our adverse experiences and our joyful experiences, they all make up who we are. I listen to a lot of interviews on podcasts and things like that about people's journey and their success and how they came to be where they are. And almost never do you hear someone reflect back on their stable and peaceful childhood and how everything went perfectly smooth, and that's how they got where they are. They reflect back on their adversity. And I don't mean to minimize it and say that whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger and that kind of approach. It's deeply damaging and sad, the adverse childhood experiences, but it also can be part of building up our strengths and building up our individuality and our uniqueness and our ability to connect with others and give us those mini superpowers that Dr. Burke-Harris referenced. And so that's where I want to be, is in that hope and in that resilience and potential of this, not dwelling on the difficult parts, but looking at them clear-eyed and seeing how can we get through this together. And so I really want to thank you for engaging so much in this. I want to thank Sam Pija and Temescal Associates and How Kids Learn Foundation, EduCare, and Stu and Armando. Thank you so much for helping me drive this. I really appreciate us doing this together and collaborating. And maybe, Stu, I'll make my announcement and then turn it over to you for the closing and any announcements you have. Is that good with you?
Sounds
great.
great.
So let me share screen again. Well, feel free to contact me. You can't exactly visit an LA's Best school site right now, but we can discuss ways to collaborate. There's my info, but this deck will go out along with other material. I want to give a big plug for an event that's happening later today. So many of you may have heard of Lights On After School. This is a national event that takes place really all week, but today's the really big day, especially for California. This is a statewide celebration of after-school expanded learning programs. It's an opportunity to show support for our after-school staff and programs. And we've got to highlight our legislative champions so that we can continue to advocate for more resources and support. I want to shout out LA's Best Director of Public Partnerships, Laura Beebe, who has led our charge to be part of CA3, the California After School Advocacy Alliance, which is really all about getting more resources to after school programs in California. Currently, it's mostly about that state funding, but it's really about all aspects. We're also looking at potential local funding and expanding any kind of support for after school programs across the state and in LA. For the first time, after school programs from across California are coming together virtually. This is free, open to the public. We want to get as many people there as we can. We hope you can join for the event and also on social media. But if you can't join for the event and you can chime in on social media, the hashtags are there. We all have increased needs as a result of the pandemic and the current recession. And it's really more important than ever that we advocate. Advocacy is not just for the advocates, it's for us as youth workers, as direct service providers. We need to share the impact of programs by engaging with our elected officials. You're not on your own, there's lots of resources. Check out Lights On After School, check out the CA3 website. If your organization isn't active, encourage them to become active. If they are, you can be active as part of that effort. So please join all of the advocacy that happens on an ongoing basis, but join today, especially at 4 o'clock. I know immediately following this, there's also the California Expanded Learning Leadership Awards that CDE, California Department of Education, is doing. I know I'm going to hop on that right after this, but please do join us for Lights On at 4 o'clock today. Hopefully we can send something out immediately after this just about Lights On. If not, just go to the CA3 website or look on social media and you'll see all the information on there. Thank you all so much for joining. This is super important that we all come together to advocate for after school programs. And with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And again, thank you to all. And Stu, I so appreciate your partnership in this. Armando, thank you for your support in driving this and everything you all do. And I'll turn it over to you, Stu, to bring us home.
Great. Well, thanks, Eric. Thanks, Ginger. Thanks, Therese, Sam, How Kids Learn, everyone for taking the time. And I just was commenting earlier when we were in our breakout of the honesty, the transparency, the reality of what we're facing moment by moment as was expressed through those conversations. So just thanks so much for LA's Best to bring that in. And with EduCare, we're close in with you on this whole trauma-informed practices. And the work we're doing with that, and thanks for the support from Sam and How Kids Learn, is to look at it through what the lens we call growth heart set, how to build that sense of compassionate communities, but also that sense of connection with ourselves and one another. And so someone said, how do you do that virtually? And I wanted to let you know, we're real excited. We've served now close to 3,000 students over the summer, high school, middle school, many of them entering into their high schools, 9th graders, with something that we've now called growth heart set and ACE heartbeats. And let me kind of bring this to full screen. And if you can see it there, is that visible for everybody? It's having this type of built connections virtually with large groups of high school kids and their teachers over a series of 1 hour, 1.25 hour Zoom workshops. Fun, team builders, trust builders, and it's been real exciting and the responses have been tremendous. 9th grade teachers going, gosh, now we get to know the kids that we not are able to physically be with. So we just want to place that into your thoughts. We're happy to serve in that way with other communities who want to bring that sense of heartbeats and connections in. And one other piece I wanted to share, that tomorrow, How Kids Learn and Thrive Global and EduCare are fortunate that we're going to be sponsoring another webinar, and that's with featuring it's on identity leadership, building the leadership from within, with Stedman Graham, and also with the Chief Training Officer of Thrive Global. Exciting folks, very engaging conversation we'll have, interactive as well. And Armando, if you could place that information in the chat room, people can sign up for that. It's complimentary. And How Kids Learn, thanks. So I want to just again put it out to each of us to take care of ourselves. I think the lesson that's being mentioned today is that secondary trauma that we're feeling, the sensitivity, what's around us with our kids and our staff, is it starts with ourselves, and then we can really share that in deeper ways with our staff. So be well. Thanks again, Eric and team, Sampia, and everyone. Continue on. Have a great rest of your day. And thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
Be well, everyone.